Welcome, I'm Anna Galetli, and we are moving on to the second part of Unit 4, where we're going to be looking at the skull. So this is part 1 of the skull. Alright, so the skull is going to be part of your axial skeleton. So remember, axis or axial is basically the core, so that's your head and your torso, whereas appendicular sounds like appendages. Alright, so that's going to be, ooh, those look really stupid, your arms and your legs. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. All right, so when I first start studying the skull, I really like to use the colored diagrams. All books do these. Any of them work fine. They just use different colors. You should be able to find some version of this as well in your APR, in your cadaver dissection kit or tool. All right, so let's start checking it out. So when you're doing anything with the bones or the muscles for that matter, I want you to touch yourself, all right? Find everything on your own body. So when I say parietal bone, you pick up your hand and you touch the side of your head, all right? So that's right here, parietal bone. When I say frontal bone, you pick up your hand and you touch your forehead, all right? When you do quizzes and tests, it's okay to do this, all right? Touch yourself, find it on yourself. You will remember it a lot better than just from a diagram. All right, so let's look at the first bones first, and then we'll look at some of the features. So you're learning the bones and you're learning the features. So you got the nasal bone right here. That's the thing that gets broken when people are fighting, okay? Your cheekbone, right? So the front of your cheek is the zygomatic bone, and you have to be careful with that because the side of your cheek, the lateral side where you put your makeup, is not the zygomatic bone. We'll talk more about that in a second. All right, you've got your maxilla bone, which is going to be the front top of your teeth and also going up either side of your nose, okay? Mandible, which is your lower jaw, over here in pink. The sphenoid bone is shaped like a butterfly. We'll look at that more later. You see a little remnant of it, or not a remnant, a little section of it from this view. Temporal bone is the lower part of the side, so when I say temporal bone, go and touch your ear. That's basically where it's at. And then the occipital bone, which is right here, right? So if you put your hand on the back of your head, you will feel that. But then the rest of the occipital bone, you can't actually touch because it's embedded in muscles. So all of this is the muscles of your neck going down here, okay? Now, the bones are formed as separate units and then they grow. And you have to have basically an area for growth for that. And we call these areas of growth where they come together a suture. And this is a type of joint. All right, we'll talk more about that in a few chapters. So you need to know these, be able to spell them. You have the coronal suture. And that coronal suture is just going to continue right down here. And then, you know, you'll see a little bit right there. That actually gets a different name, so don't worry about that. So coronal suture right there. All right, now let's move on to the squamosal, really weird name, I know. So that's going to be between the parietal and your temporal bone right here. The lambdoidal, please don't abbreviate lambdoid, it's lambdoidal, put the AL on the end. That forms a little section here, okay? Now that's called a Wormian bone or a sutural ossicle. Those are perfectly normal, they're just little islands of bone that form. So that's there, okay? I think those are the three that I have on here. And then one more thing I want to point out, and not all your books point out the temporal line, but I want you to know it, and I want you to know it well. And the reason I want you to know it is because this is where your your temporalis muscle attaches. And so this is a bony feature. It's a ridging of bone caused by the muscle attachment. So you can see where I'm kind of doing this shading right here. I don't know if that's very noticeable. It looks good on my side. And it's just a raised ridge of bone where your temporalis muscle is going to attach and pull on it. So when we get to do the muscular system, it's easier to remember that muscle if you can remember the temporal line, which is created by that muscle pulling on it. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, so now we are looking at a posterior view, and you can see the two parietal bones right here, and you can see a new suture, the sagittal suture, which runs from the coronal all the way back to the lambdoidal. And then this right here is where the lambdoidal suture is located. So you've got a parietal, and then down here, that's your occipital bone. Okay, so the sagittal suture separates the two parietal bones. And you may remember the word sagittal because we learned about the sagittal plane. So the sagittal plane divides the body into right and left sides. The sagittal suture divides the right parietal from the left parietal. Okay, now I like the lambdoidal suture right here because it forms this cute little triangle. And then you can see right here where I've got the wormian bones, and they go right there. Let me change the color so you can see that. So this is a wormian bone. Here's another one. Not everyone gets these. Some people have a lot of them. Some people have one. Some people have none. Okay. So some other features. I want you to take your hand, and I want you to feel the back of your skull as far down as you can before you hit muscle, or before you hit where the really thick part of your neck muscle is. So there's always muscle there. That section, you'll feel, if you're a guy, you might like have a little hook or bump that's really pronounced. Women, these are more delicate, and so they tend to be just a slight ridge. This is called the external occipital protuberance. It's caused by the muscle attachments from your neck muscles. Okay, same thing right here. Let me switch to that shading thing again. I wonder if there's a darker gray. There it is. So right here, oh, that darker gray isn't really very good. Let's we'll just switch to black. So right there and right there, those are ridges of bone that we call nuchal lines. And they are also caused by muscle attachment sites. So when you are learning the bone, learn these features, and then when we go to study the muscles, these muscles will be a little bit easier to remember. All right, so now we are on the temporal bone, and again, I want you to touch yourself. Go ahead and touch your ear. So where you are putting, so if you put your finger in your ear hole, that's going to be right here. Okay, and that is your external auditory meatus or external acoustic meatus. So either of those terms are correct. Okay, now take your finger and go right behind your earlobe. You will see or feel a ridge, and this ridge is called the mastoid process. You don't need to learn the mastoid notch, just scratch that off. So the mastoid process. This is also created by muscles. All right, these are the muscles that help you hold your head up. So when you have a newborn baby, they don't really have much of a mastoid process, if any at all, because they can't hold their head up. So as the baby learns to hold its head up and it develops muscle strength, it begins to grow a mastoid process. Right here, we've got this hook called a styloid process. So that's all a styloid. You see that word used generically throughout the skeletal system. So you just need to know that this is the styloid process of the temporal bone, also caused by muscle attachments. All right, you see a remnant of the squamosal suture up here. And then this is the one that I really want you to pay attention right here, the zygomatic arch or the zygomatic process. Both of those terms are fine. This is located right here. So this is where you put the makeup brush for your blush. Okay? Now, if you want to go and look like a baby doll and you do the little circle in the very front, that would go right here. Okay? But most of us are putting our makeup back here in order to accentuate those high cheekbones. So technically, that's part of the temporal bone, whereas that is part of the zygomatic bone. So be aware of that distinction so that you don't get a test question wrong. Okay, and then one more feature that's really important. We all like to eat, which means we need to be able to chew, which means we need to be able to move our mandible. The mandible goes in right here. All right, and this is a joint surface that we call the mandibular fossa. So a fossa is just a depression. All right, and so mandibular fossa, depression for the mandible. All right. All right, now we are cutting the top of the skull off and we are looking into the cranial cavity. So I call this the inferior internal cranial cavity. Okay, so we've taken everything out, the brains are all gone. And again, I like this picture because you can see the parts. Why did my little R get pushed down? So that's the anterior view. So I want you to imagine little eyes here, okay, in the front. Looking forward, those look, that's really creepy. And then the posterior, so this is the back of your head, okay? So in this pinkish color, all of this pinkish color here, this is all the ethmoid bone, okay? Now the ethmoid bone has two features that I want you to know, the crista galli and the cribriform plate. Crista means like a crown or crest. Galli means chicken or rooster. So this is basically the cock's comb, okay, or the cock's crest or the chicken's crest, whatever you want to say. So this is like, it literally sticks up like a hook, and this is the attachment for the dura mater. So that's what you need to be able to say about it, is it's created by the attachment of the dura mater from the brain. Now the cribriform plate is this flat area, all right? So this is horizontal and flat. You've got one on either side, and what you need to know is it's got little holes that go through it, lots of them. These holes are for olfactory nerves to go into your nasal cavity, okay? Now next bone, right here in this lavendery color, is your sphenoid bone. I think it looks kind of like a butterfly. It has a ton of features, and luckily you don't have to learn all of them, just a few really cool ones. We like to see. So you need to get a nerve from your brain to your eyeballs, or from your eyeballs to your brain. You do that through the optic canal. So there's two of them, one here and one there, okay? Then you have a pituitary gland. The pituitary gland makes a lot of seriously important hormones. You could say it's kind of driving things, but it's not the commander. The commander is actually your hypothalamus. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary what it wants to do, and then the pituitary does it. So the pituitary is going to be sitting in a saddle in command, and that saddle is called the sella turcica. This literally means Turk's saddle. All right, I don't know why. It looks like a Turkish saddle, I guess. Now, off to the side of the Turkish saddle, or sella turcica, we have three little holes. They are the foramen rotundum, where cranial nerve 5 goes through, the foramen ovale, which also has a segment of cranial nerve 5, and then over here, very difficult to see in this view, is the foramen spinosum, which has a strand of the mandibular nerve going through it. So, somewhere you will see references to Farmer-Ross. Okay, R-O-S, R-O-S. Farmer-Ross, he is the pituitary gland, sitting in the sella turcica. Rotundum is R, ovale is O, spinosum is S. So that's a trick for remembering that. All right, over here in yellow, we see the two temporal bones. Again, many features. You're only using a few of them. So on the outside, all right, you remember you had the zygomatic arch, the external auditory meatus, the mandibular fossa, and the mastoid process. Internally, we are going to learn the foramen lacerum, okay, and the jugular foramen, all right, and we are going to learn the internal auditory meatus. Now, for some reason, the arrow did not show up on foramen lacerum, so let's go ahead and put that in. All right, let me pick a different color so that we can see a little better, because it's kind of hard to see. So right there is where the foramen lacerum is, and so then we'll draw the line back to this, okay? So there's your foramen lacerum. All right, then the jugular foramen is located right here. Notice that it's formed partially by the temporal and partially by the occipital. This is a really important hole. Internal jugular vein goes through it, but also several cranial nerves. you definitely should be able to identify your jugular foramen and be able to say basically what goes through it. So a vein goes through it, some cranial nerves go through it. All right, and then one more hole. Let's change color again. Let's see if the yellow shows up. So right there in yellow, that is your internal auditory meatus. So you need to get the nerves from the brain to your inner ear so you can hear and so that you have balance. So that's how you do that, is through those holes. Okay? All right, so moving on, let's change colors again. Occipital. Again, lots of features. We're only going to focus on 2 right now. Humongous hole. Foramen magnum. So magnum, major. Foramen hole. Major hole. Major freaking hole. The biggest hole in your body, practically. What you want to know, the spinal cord goes through it. All right, then off to the side of the foramen magnum, you have 2 holes, right here and right here. For the right and left hypoglossal nerves, these are called the hypoglossal canals, so that works out pretty well. All right, moving on. All right, so this is the kind of thing that you're going to be able to label, identify, and say what a feature or structure does or how it's created. You need to be able to do it on a picture like this. So this is a photo that I've taken of the skulls from the lab. You can also use the same basic photo from your APR dissection tool. So I know that if I'm looking at this, let me use blue, I have my ethmoid bone, and I can just go through and I can start labeling these: ethmoid, temporal, occipital, and then I'm just going to write sphenoid there. Oops, I made a mistake. That is the ethmoid. This is actually the frontal. Okay, I got a little overexcited there in writing my stuff. On the ethmoid, this section right here, that's my cribriform plate. And that's for my olfactory nerves. Okay, and then right here, oh, look at that cute thing. That's the cristagalli. And that's for dura mater. This is what you want to be doing, is you want to be taking a picture, labeling everything, and then, you know, make a little note to the side that says what it does or what forms it. Oh, look, here's my sella turcica. Sella T, this is where my pituitary gland goes. Okay, I've got Farmer Ross, rotundum, ovale, spinosum. Okay, jugular foramen. All right, these are all really important features. Go through and practice this on your own. Okay. All right, so now we're going to do some close-ups of some of the bones. We've got a few more slides and then we'll go on to part 2. So this is our ethmoid bone. So what I want you to look at is right here where it's located. So this is basically deeper in your body, in the skull, behind your nasal cavity, behind your nasal bones right here. You've got 2 sides over here and over here. And then you've got this thing that actually sticks down into the nasal cavity. This is an important feature for you to memorize. This is called the perpendicular plate, and you can see this if you cut off the nose and you start looking in. It helps to separate your nasal cavity into the right and left halves, along with the vomer nasal cartilage. So it separates the nasal cavity, okay? Now, up here, we've already looked at this thing, which is your cristagalli. All right, this is sticking up, and this is where the dura mater attaches. Now this is really nice because you can really see what the cribriform plate looks like. So this is your cribriform plate here and here. I know that this bracket may be a little misleading, but just remember that, let me circle this is the cristagalli in blue. All right, and then in red, you have the cribriform plate. And what you will see are all these little holes that the olfactory nerves are going through. Now you've got several paranasal sinuses in the skull. The ethmoid has a right and a left. So there's your right and there's your left, and these are the sinuses. You can see it, so these are air cavities. All right, let's look at an inferior view now. Let's start with things we should be really familiar with. We've got our occipital here. You have a little remnant of the parietal over here, not a remnant, just a little bit that's visible, the parietal there. Over here, we've got temporal and again, temporal. All right, this green is a new one for you. This is the palatine bone right here. And then in orange, we have the maxilla. All right, and so we've got some maxilla there and some maxilla there. We'll do Z for zygomatic. And then in purple, right here, you have the butterfly bone, the sphenoid. Okay, we've got one more new one. We have the vomer. You can see this from underneath like this. You can also see this if you look again in the nasal cavity. The vomer will be on the inferior edge. The perpendicular plate of the ethmoid will be on the superior edge, and it's dividing this up into the two sides of the nasal cavity, just like the perpendicular plate does. Okay, now we've got some features. From the outside, you can see the jugular foramen. All right, so that's there and there. You've also got another new one that's really important, the carotid canal here and here. Okay, let's change colors so that we don't get those confused with the jugular foramen. Maybe I should have done those in red. So this is where the internal carotid artery is going up into the brain. All right, and then in yellow, I'm going to do these surfaces. These are joint surfaces, and these are called the occipital condyle. So whenever you see the word condyle, you're talking about some kind of articular surface. So this is where your skull attaches to the first cervical vertebra. What are we missing? The foramen lacerum, you can see a little bit better from this side. And there's a lot other features, and we'll just kind of leave it at that. Oh, and don't forget your foramen magnum. All right, moving on. So again, you want to take either the pictures from our images for activities or these PowerPoints, or using the APR pictures of the skulls, and you want to go through and you want to label everything. Foramen magnum. Right here, I've got an occipital condyle. All right, you want to go through and do all of that. Now, with holes, I like to stick things through them so you can really see where they're going to. That's a little bit harder to do if you're not using this material in the lab. But you've got a picture, and I'm sharing it with you. So right here I have a green pipe cleaner that I've stuck through the jugular foramen. And remember that this jugular foramen goes between the temporal and occipital bones. And then in pink, I'm using a pipe cleaner to stick it through the carotid canal. And I'm doing this because when you look at a bone and it's not color-coded, it can be really easy to mix up the green pipe cleaners going through the jugular foramen and then the carotid canal, because they're right next to each other. So one thing to remember is that the jugular foramen is closer to the foramen magnum than the carotid canal is, okay? It's between the temporal bone and the occipital. So sometimes trying to remember that stuff helps. That, or stick something through it so that you remember, okay? That was the last slide in part 1. So now we will go on to part 2 of the skull.